Question: what gives us the right to go beyond the limits of thinking and leave the unity of thinking behind in order to move from thinking to meditation? Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that this question concerns something highly significant that can only be made comprehensible in its entirety through careful epistemological and critical reflections. Nevertheless, I will try to point out this or that consideration that should be taken into account in answering this question. If you'll allow me, I want to draw your attention to the last chapter I added to the second edition of my book titled The Riddles of Philosophy, in which I explain the course of philosophy's development, and then tried to show that especially in the present moment of humanity's development, philosophy has reached the point where in a sense it demands of its own accord that thinking go beyond the standpoint that appears when we come to the limits of what the natural sciences can know about nature. In that added chapter, I try to show the following. When you study closely the methods of acquiring knowledge, as the great physiologist Dubois-Reymond did, for example, then you can come to the same point of view described by Dubois-Reymond in the lecture entitled The Limits of Our Knowledge of Nature, which he gave in the 1870s before the prestigious Congress of the German scientists and physicians in Leipzig, and which he repeated in his talk entitled The Seven World Riddles. I merely want to point out briefly that back then Dubois-Reymond said that by applying what has been called uniform thinking, we generate what is called Laplace's demon. That is, we develop a way of thinking about matter that becomes possible when we seek to comprehend the course of a solar system's planets by means of the methods of astronomy and mathematics. When by means of a certain inner contemplation, we now turn our gaze to what is going on there within us, that is, when we try to turn the subject into an object of investigation, then we will find that this thinking we develop there cannot simply be defined by saying it is there in order to reflect an outside world, or to synthesize the facts of an outside world. In that way of speaking about thinking, I still see a vestige of the old teleology, that old teaching of utilitarianism that always asks only what for and never why. That sort of thinking does not ask how it is that the entire organization of the human body or of any other organism, or of a part of the body such as the hand, is formed in a particular way. Instead, it only asks how the hand had best be designed to serve a specific purpose. Even though we are not aware of this anymore today, or may not yet be aware of it, this approach has also extended to how thinking is observed. The question asked about thinking is then what its purpose is. We may not always explicitly ask this, but we ask it unconsciously. We generally believe that thinking, and knowing in general, exists so that we can, in a sense, take in the external world, absorb it into ourselves, so that what is initially out there, we then have within us, even if only as an image. Now, we can realistically, spiritually realistically, of course, observe what thinking really is. And there we find that this thinking is indeed a real force that shapes us. You see, the spiritual science I am talking about here is not an abstract theory, not something that wants to be only just another worldview in ideas. Among other things, I recently taught a pedagogical course in which I tried to apply spiritual science to pedagogy. The course was for teachers and was held before the Waldorf School was founded. In addition to this pedagogical course, I also held one that sought to present the therapeutic element of medicine, based on spiritual science, and to show how spiritual research can cast light on something we can actually never fully access when we use only the current methods of physiology and biology. Now, I don't want to go into therapeutic detail, but I want to just tell you something to characterize the method. Namely, I want to say this. In philosophy, as it is now commonly practiced, people always speculate about the connection between what is soul-spiritual on the one hand and the physical body on the other. There are all kinds of theories about their interactions, about parallelism and so on, including all sorts of materialistic interpretations of what happens in the soul. But people look at all this in a certain abstraction, seeing the soul spiritual separately on one side and on the other the physical body, and then they speculate on what the relationship between those two could be, how it could come about. Now, spiritual science studies the matter methodically, precisely with the thinking it awakens, and so studies how the soul spiritual works in the physical body. And even though what I now say may be misunderstood and may be taken as a paradox, I still want to emphasize the following. When you observe how children grow and develop up to their second dentition at about the age of 7, you see that the growth of the new permanent teeth is not the only thing that is happening there. Rather, there is also a significant change in the configuration of children's soul spiritual element. When you think back to your own childhood, you will find, even without yet studying the matter methodically, that the sharply contoured thoughts that then solidify into memories and spread throughout the course of your life could not develop until that time when the organism pushes out the permanent teeth. This development, the growth of the permanent teeth, is something that comes from the organism as a whole, not just from the jawbones. When you examine this further, methodically, you will realize that what is happening here is much like what happens in physical processes when one kind of power, for example mechanical power, is transformed into warmth, let's say. So, we can say that warmth is released and arises. Likewise, you will see that in the course of human life, what works in the organism in dentition and takes on physical existence is released when the second dentition is gradually completed. It moves from a latent state, where it worked initially only inwardly, to a state of being free and available. Thus a certain inner system of forces has been active in the organism and has worked until the permanent teeth emerge. At that time, when the permanent teeth have come in, that conglomeration of forces is released, becomes available, and in this release now appears as that soul spiritual power which gives us the sharply contoured thoughts of the memory. I merely want to show you with this example that spiritual science is in fact applied to areas we don't think of today. Spiritual science is a continuation of the natural sciences. It is the same form of thinking we apply when we talk of warmth being released in a process, and this way of thinking, which we now have developed, we then apply to human development. And there we see that what appears to us as memory, as the power of thinking, is the very same power that pushes out the permanent teeth, if I may be allowed to speak in such trivial terms. What we have there, then, is not speculation about the relationship between body and soul. Rather, we trace completely empirically, the way we are accustomed to as natural researchers, only with somewhat more highly developed methods of thinking, what we can observe. In other words, everything around us is also observed spiritually. And that is how we come to the point where we no longer talk about the interaction between body, soul, and spirit in an abstract, nebulous way. Instead, we can explain how at a certain age a force works physically in your body, a force that then emancipates itself and becomes a spiritual soul force in a different period of life. In other words, we can enter with our spirit into the material realm. We can understand matter spiritually. And that is really the peculiar thing, that materialism actually did not understand matter, that it confronted matter in such a way that matter remained opaque, essentially unknown to materialism. Materialism did not, in fact, understand the very thing it concerned itself with. It did not understand matter. Spiritual science, as it is meant here, penetrates through its spiritual method to an understanding of matter. And indeed, the doctors and medical students attending the lecture course on medicine found it extremely interesting that they could learn to see how the work of the soul spiritual aspect effectively manifests in the body. For example, how one can demonstrate that through spiritual science the function of the heart can be understood quite differently than with the methods of contemporary physiology and biology. That is what matters. That thinking, in fact, develops further, not through some fanciful, fantastic thought formation, but through a consistent continuation of thinking, which nevertheless has to go through a boundary state or critical condition. In going through this boundary state, thinking changes and becomes something different from what it was before. You should not say that the unity of thinking is thus in some way destroyed. For example, the force active in ice does not become something that should no longer exist once the ice melts and becomes water. And the force active in water does not become something else once the water reaches the boiling point and evaporates. Likewise, what matters is that at one point which I have characterized as a point in the development of thinking, this thinking force passes through such a boundary state, after which it appears in a changed form. As a result, our experiences then differ qualitatively from the experiences before, just as steam differs from water. But through this change, we come to understand thinking, to understand the force of thinking itself as something real that is active in us. And I could say the same thing for willing, too. We can then see that in the thinking power we have in later life, there still is what has worked in the body when we were children. That is, everything becomes, in a peculiar way, one unity, one whole. I will gladly admit that spiritual science may be wrong regarding various individual issues. It is still in its beginnings, after all. But that is not what matters here. Rather, what matters is the direction in which we are striving. Thus we can say, spiritual science is trying to observe how what reveals itself in thinking also shapes the entire human being. That is, we want to observe it as a real force that shapes and forms and permeates the entire human organism. We look at thinking in all its reality. Therefore, ultimately, we must realize that those who still look at thinking from a critical and epistemological perspective, by asking only about its purpose, asking why thinking is such that it combines our sensory perceptions of the external world, those people are succumbing to a certain error. An error I now want to describe to you in more detail. Let us suppose a grain of wheat, or an ear of wheat, grows up out of the root and out through the stalk. In other words, what we see there is the plant-forming force of nature expressing itself. It is able to form an entirely new plant out of the seed, and that plant in turn develops seeds for new plants, and so on. We see the formative force working continuously and consistently in the plant from one form to the next, or as Goethe said, from metamorphosis to metamorphosis. Now, in spiritual science, we try to examine the thinking that expresses itself as a formative force in us. And there we realize, insofar as thinking is a formative force in human beings, it also has a side effect. And this side effect is nothing other than our ordinary knowing. Now, if I were to characterize thinking in its essence based on this side effect, it would be like saying, I don't care about the formative force that rises up through the plant, from the roots, through the stalks, and into the ears. I don't care about all that. Instead, what I want to do is examine the matter from the perspective of food chemistry and simply study the nutritional substances that can be found in the grain of wheat. Of course, this is also a valid way of looking at the grain of wheat. There is nothing wrong with studying it in that light. But by doing so, we disregard what is actually continuously happening in the formation of the plant. Now, the same is true for knowledge. In thinking of epistemologists and philosophers and those who want to establish the foundations of the natural sciences through their investigations, there are the same effects that occur when thinking, which really wants to shape and form us, expresses itself outwardly in a side effect. This is much like considering only what grows in the wheat plant as the basis for another creature's food. But it is wrong to study wheat only in that regard, only as a source of food. This view has nothing to do with the essence of the wheat grain. For that, I will introduce a different perspective. Contemporary philosophy is on the wrong track when it looks at knowledge only in the light of what it can do for an understanding of the external world. For the main point here is that thinking is a formative force in the human being, and everything else is really only a side effect. And the perspective that wants to leave thinking at the level of abstracting the laws of nature and collecting perceptions is precisely the same as that of people who claim that we should not study plants from the perspective of botany in order to come to know their essence, but should instead study them only from the standpoint of nutritional chemistry. These are the things people don't think of today, but they play a big role in the future development of science. That future of the sciences that is also the future of a social form, the understanding of which will enable human beings actually to intervene in this social form by means of the Spirit. For it seems to me that what has led to the present catastrophe is precisely that we no longer master life, because we do not think of the fact that we have entered a phase of human development in which life must be mastered based on the Spirit, based on that Spirit we can know from within, and can also recognize in what meets us in the outer world. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, saying these things makes one a misfit or a dreamer in the eyes of many today. Certainly, when we say these things, people do not expect us to actually have a realistic understanding of the outer world. But I believe it's safe to say that the application of spiritual science to the entire outside world can be compared with the following. When someone has a horseshoe-shaped piece of iron, a farmer comes and says, "I'll use it on my horse." Another person who knows what the piece of iron really is tells the farmer, "No, this is not a horseshoe, but a magnet, and it has a very different purpose." The farmer then might say, "I don't care about that. It doesn't matter to me. I will shoe my horse with it." Indeed, this is how that kind of science today appears to me, a science that refuses at all costs to admit that the spiritual dwells everywhere in the material. People who deny the presence of the spiritual in matter are much like the farmer in our little story. They too would say, "What do I care about the magnet? What matters to me is shoeing my horse with this iron." However, I believe the realization must dawn on us that in all matter We must come to know not just something abstract spiritual, but something concrete spiritual. And then we have to make the effort to study the concrete spiritual in detail, just as we do when we study matter. Doing so will mean progress for the future in terms of our knowledge and in regard to our future social relationships. Of course, it is easier to speculate and talk about all sorts of philosophies concerning what spirit is. For example, it is easier to be a pantheist or something similar based on such speculations than to continue scientific studies following the model and rigor of the natural sciences, with, of course, the experiential method I have just described. Speculating is easier than following a strict method, but with the latter we find the spiritual in matter. Just as when heat is not yet manifest, we can make it so if we show under what condition something that is otherwise latent becomes manifest. If we use this method, which people generally apply only to the outer world, and apply it to the inner world, in particular to the whole human being, then we will comprehend the spiritual in matter from within us. Above all, this will then also gradually fulfill what has been handed down to us since ancient times, and what is a deep necessity for human beings to fulfill, namely, what still reverberates in our inner spiritual ears from the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Human being, know thyself. And in the same way in which philosophers and theologians have spoken about this know thyself, so did the natural scientist Ernst Haeckel, who always tended more or less toward materialism. This know thyself lies in the depths of our nature. And in modern times we have reached the point where this know thyself must be met in a concrete way. I believe I have shown you, with these brief remarks, that we do not sin against the unity of thinking, but rather are continuing thinking beyond a boundary. Just as it is possible to bring the forces in water to reveal themselves in a different way after water has reached the boiling point, so taking thinking beyond the boundary point is not a sin against what we experience in combinatory thinking and sensory perception. Of course, it goes without saying that this thinking then undergoes a metamorphosis. But we have nevertheless not sinned in any way against any kind of unity of thinking. You will not find that spiritual science leads you to a rejection of the natural sciences. Rather, you will come to a deeper understanding of them. That is, you will come precisely to the point I consider especially important for the development of humanity, namely a fruitful introduction of the natural sciences' findings into an entire worldview. This can only be achieved if we advance from the intellectual perception of nature to the experience of the spiritual, which can then flow into our willing and become a living force in us. Because it can do this, and because living knowledge makes us both wise and more skillful, I believe in a future for humanity in its progress, if in the future, more so than has been the case up to now, we look at the spiritual in matter, indeed seek the spirit in matter, so that then the spiritual can also be applied to the social sphere. That will show us the solution to the social question in the permeation of our social world with the spiritual. That is, we can then spiritualize the social realm with precisely that spirit that we can attain as the continuation and furthering of scientific research. Professor Dr. Theodor Meyer. I fully agree with Dr. Steiner that the boundary concepts of natural scientific knowledge are not boundary concepts of being and reality. I have also listened with warm interest, and my heart was touched when Dr. Steiner spoke of the hopes that the German people can have for the future, despite the recent collapse. Nevertheless, I have doubts about whether anthroposophically oriented spiritual science will have the ability to lead us to the new heights to which Germany should aspire. And in my opinion, the doubt concerns the following. Dr. Steiner has emphasized repeatedly that the path to the higher worlds, the path he spoke of, is reached by way of inner perception or contemplation, by a perceiving consciousness, that is, through an experience, and that this path is definitely science and not fantasy. This inner seeing, of course, also provides logical evidence. That is, what I have seen with my physical eyes or my spiritual eyes is undeniable. For example, when I see a tree, I do not have to prove that there must be a tree there. There is no metaphysical proof for this. It is evident that the tree is there. Dr. Steiner now claims, for his inner seeing, that same quality of self-evidence. That is, he sees the higher world, and sees the interrelationships in this higher world, and because he sees them, that is precisely why this higher world is there. It is undeniable. Indeed, I do not want to deny that the higher world is self-evident for those who perceive it. But the question arises then whether it is evident in the same way for everyone, and that is where I have doubts. Since I have become familiar with Anthroposophy, it has claimed that this inner perception, this perceiving consciousness, is ancient, that there have already long ago been individuals who have been able to advance to the level of this perceiving consciousness, for example, in India. That is why Anthroposophy has adopted a number of terms from the languages of India. It uses Indian expressions for some of the various spiritual insights it conveys. But the fact is that Dr. Steiner now claims again that he is bringing us something new. But there were a number of theosophical associations in Germany and also in England before Dr. Steiner came on the scene. Indeed, Dr. Steiner originally belonged to these theosophical associations, but then he came into conflict with them and resigned from these associations. Precisely because he came into inner conflict with them, he has no longer used the designation theosophy for his view of things, but because his inner vision is different from that of other theosophists, he called it Anthroposophy. And now I'd like to say the following. If the earlier perceiving consciousness was wrong, if only Dr. Steiner has brought us the correct and true one, what guarantee do I have that another person won't come along later and say that this higher perceiving consciousness that Dr. Steiner brought did not advance to the ultimate goal either? Someone else may arrive at a very different destination. That is what makes Dr. Steiner's perceiving consciousness subjective. It is only one person's, namely his, perceiving consciousness. Whether we can rely on it is doubtful to me. That is what worries me regarding the suprasensory component of the entire movement, that there are different kinds of inner perception at work here. There should not be any conflict arising between the various seers. But I do not want to conclude without expressing my sincere and warmest thanks to Dr. Steiner for the many varied, subtle, and excellent suggestions he has presented to us in his talk this evening. Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't need to keep you much longer because I will only have to point out a few errors in the most important part of the concerns presented by the previous speaker. First of all, it is a matter of correcting a few errors, and here I want to start from the end, so to speak. First, it is not the case that what I presented to you here was preceded by the teachings of other theosophical associations to which I belonged. This is not true. Rather, in the 1880s, I began writing my interpretations of Goethe's worldview. Back then, those writings were published as the introduction to Goethe's writings on the natural sciences in Kirchner's series titled Deutsche Nationalliteratur, German National Literature, in Stuttgart. Those who study that introduction will find that it already contains the seeds of what I have presented to you today. You will find that in the first edition of my titled Philosophy of Freedom, in 1894, I have tried to set forth how human beings, by developing their thinking, can gradually advance to a certain level. And what followed then was what led discursive thinking into perceiving thinking. Then, around 1902 in Berlin, I was asked by a circle that called itself Theosophical to lecture about the spirit. Back then I had met several Theosophists, but what they told me did not prompt me to give much attention to or pursue the theosophical literature that was common in this Theosophical society. And so I gave a talk about what had revealed itself to me in my own perceptive research. One consequence of this was that people in England, who had read my book titled Mystics at the Dawn of the Modern Age, soon translated those lectures of mine into English and published them in an English journal. I was then asked to give lectures to a number of people in that society, which called itself the Theosophical Society. Whatever they called themselves, in communicating with the people who asked me to give lectures, I have never held back about what I have to say. Indeed, I have never represented anything anywhere that did not originate out of my own research. Thus, in the time I was a member of the Theosophical Society, I have never set forth anything except what I can set forth based on my own research. That already, at that time, I called what I presented Anthroposophy may be obvious to you from the fact that at that time, and not only later, when I had perhaps come to a different view from the one that society held, I also gave talks to another circle of people in Berlin. And what I said there did not differ by one iota from what I had to say based on my own research. And to make sure people would not jump to the wrong conclusions or misunderstand, I announced my lectures as Anthroposophical Contemplations on the Development of Humanity. In other words, I have been calling my worldview Anthroposophy for just as long as people can connect my name with Theosophy. There was never a rift. That is all I want to say now about this in order to not keep you too long. Now, ladies and gentlemen, some people say that when we study the history of philosophy, we will find that philosophers, starting with Thales and all the way up to Eucken and others, have presented all kinds of views and have often contradicted each other. So how can we possibly come to any certainty in knowing? And that is the very question I made it my task to answer in my book titled The Riddles of Philosophy. In that book I wanted to show that the above assessment of philosophy is wrong, and to explain that the seeming divergences in the various philosophies that are worthy of that name are always simply the result of one person looking at the phenomena of the world from one standpoint, while another person looks at them from a different standpoint. For example, if you take a picture of a tree from one side, then in the picture you will see the tree only from that side. If you take a picture of the same tree from another side, you will get a different picture. It's still the same tree, but the pictures will look different. By the same token, when philosophies with real truth content differ from each other, it is not because one deviates from the other, but because both look at one and the same thing from different standpoints. After all, we cannot arrive at one truth. So, you see, it is prejudiced to say that philosophies contradict each other. As I have shown in my book titled The Riddles of Philosophy, it is a prejudice to say that philosophers contradict each other. True, there are some that disagree with each other to a certain extent, but these are generally the ones who are mistaken anyway. After all, the fact that two kids in a class solve a math problem in different ways does not justify the conclusion that we can therefore not be sure which one of them has found the correct solution. We know what is right when we understand the correct solution. In other words, simply that things are different is no reason to conclude that they are wrong. That conclusion is only justified if it is based on the inner process of the thing itself. And that is what we should look at, the inner process. the inner course of events. And it is purely superficial observation to say, quote, Steiner left the Theosophical Society, close quote. First of all, I did not leave, but rather, after having been dragged into that society by hook or by crook to give lectures about my own worldview, and mind you, I have never lectured on anything else, then I was, if I may use an expression that is usually frowned upon, thrown out. I was thrown out, ladies and gentlemen, for the simple reason that the, quote, other kind of truth, close quote, predominated, namely the folly of those theosophists who had finally managed to present to the world an Indian boy of whom they claimed he was the reincarnated Christ. He was brought to Europe, and it was said that Christ was re-embodied in that boy. Since I characterized this foolishness as foolishness, of course, and this foolishness back then had thousands of enthusiastic followers all over the world, these followers took this occasion to expel me. I did not care. In any case, I did not believe that what one has achieved through inner research should in any way be made to seem uncertain just because a society that calls itself theosophical expels someone. A society, moreover, that claims Christ has been reincarnated in that Indian boy. We must not look at things from such a superficial perspective, by simply ignoring everything concrete and saying that there are just different views on the matter. We really have to look more closely at what is happening. And therefore, I would like to put it to you, when you have a moment of spare time, but it would be a lot for you to do, to compare all the quackeries that have emerged in the so-called theosophical societies with what I have always tried to present on a solid scientific basis. I am not saying this because I am presumptuous, but because I know the reality of the matter and speak based on my own spiritual wrestling with this. And keep in mind that I myself have said today that it is possible to go wrong in individual details. But what matters here is to show you a new direction. It is by no means necessary that every individual detail is absolutely correct. For example, people could say that they get all sorts of insights when they look at a right triangle. Then someone else may say that the square of the hypotenuse of that triangle equals the sum of the squares on the two legs of the triangle. Could we then be sure that this last person was correct, and that the theorem is generally true? After all, only one person said so. No, when the internal reasons and inner perception of mathematics have shown us that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the legs of the triangle, then it doesn't matter if 1,000,000 people say it is not so. I still know it is true, and will contradict 1,000,000 others. For the truth indeed does not only have an external ground through congruence, but also, above all, it has a foundation in its inner substantiality. Of course, anyone can verify this, and I have never claimed anything else than that anyone who wants to can learn the methods of spiritual science, just as he or she can learn the methods of chemistry. For once things have been researched, they can then be verified by any thinking person. And so, what I have been saying or writing based on spiritual science can be verified by any thinking person. There are sure to be some errors in it, of course, but that's no different from what we find with other research. What matters are not the individual errors, but rather the basic character of the whole. Have I used even one Indian expression in speaking to you today? And even if something is occasionally designated by using some ancient expression, then that is just a technical term we use precisely because our current language does not yet have a fitting term. If I can prove the Pythagorean theorem or something else on the blackboard, is it justified to criticize this because the theorem has been in existence for many centuries already? As far as I am concerned, what matters is not whether we bring up anything from ancient India or the like. What matters is to present what follows from the thing itself. Today, those who understand and grasp the Pythagorean theorem do so based on the matter itself, namely, based on the triangle. Nevertheless, though we find that this theorem emerged for the first time at a certain point in history, much must be, even if only seemingly, in accord with what was already there. But what I have always resisted most vigorously is the notion that what we are working toward here, based on our current moment in the history of human consciousness, has anything at all to do with some ancient Indian mysticism or the like. Echoes are there, of course, because people's instinctive knowing in ancient times discovered much that must re-emerge today. But what I am talking about is not drawn from ancient traditions. Rather, it is developed in such a way that what I wrote in the first edition of my book titled Theosophy in 1904 is true for me. Namely, that I want to present only what I have realized through spiritual science in just the same way as others have uncovered other scientific truths through external observation and deductive thinking. That is, I want to present only what I can personally vouch for myself. Surely other people may have an opinion, but I am presenting here nothing more and nothing other than what I myself can vouch for personally. And I am not saying this out of presumptuousness, but because I want to appear as a person who wants to establish a new spiritual science, entirely along no other lines than those of the modern natural sciences and the new technology. And also because I think that we can understand this new consciousness, especially its scientific and technical characteristics, only when we are driven by both of these to a perception of the Spirit. I ask that you please do not take my words as though I had wanted to evade what the esteemed previous speaker has said. No, on the contrary, I am grateful to him for giving me the opportunity to correct some actual errors that have become quite widespread. But some, or indeed much, of what is now circulated about what I have lectured on for decades in Stuttgart too, is actually based on errors. And it seemed necessary to me, as the previous speaker so commendably did, to go into more detail about what I have presented. For it is not a matter of just correcting facts and details that concern me personally, but also of putting something right by means of history that the previous speaker connected with the substantive part of the question. Question: if Dr. Steiner can prove for me just one point of spiritual science, in the way the Pythagorean theorem can be proved, then I will gladly follow him. Then it is a science. Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, who can really prove the Pythagorean theorem? I cannot prove that theorem by drawing a right triangle on the board, and then carrying on the proof using one of the usual methods. That is really only a demonstration, an illustration of the proof. After all, the person wanting to prove the Pythagorean theorem must necessarily have an inner perception of what can be construed mathematically, even if only in the inner perception of geometric space. Thus, imagine a consciousness that does not have that perception of space. Such a consciousness could not face what is substantive in the Pythagorean theorem, and so it would make no sense to prove that theorem. We can prove the Pythagorean theorem only by having what is substantive in spatial perception and spatial form in our purview. As soon as we advance to a different form of consciousness, something else is added to the ordinary perception of space. Bracket, there's a gap in the shorthand record here, close bracket. In other words, if we are to prove the Pythagorean theorem, we must have this spatial perception as the foundation. For this, it is initially necessary, above all, that we find our way into this new configuration of consciousness. But without perception of spatial organization, it is not even possible to arrive at the level of postulation that leads to the proof of the Pythagorean theorem. And unless the transition from ordinary consciousness to experiential consciousness, which I have described, has been accomplished, we will continue believing that the results of spiritual science cannot be proven, in the same way as that theorem can be. I started from the assumption that experiential consciousness exists first. And just as without perception of spatial organization, we cannot even talk about the Pythagorean theorem, so we cannot talk about proving any proposition of spiritual science when we do not acknowledge its entire perspective. But this perspective or outlook is something that must first be attained. It does not just appear by itself. Our times, however, demand that we decide and choose something entirely new in order to move on to this progress in science. And I really believe that much must still be overcome before spiritual science will meet its broader circles, with what the Copernican worldview encountered in relation to all earlier worldviews regarding the infinity of space. In earlier times, people imagined a blue sphere up there. Now we imagine that there are limits or boundaries to knowledge of nature that cannot be overcome. In other words, we think that we cannot advance beyond ordinary thinking. Such things are indeed well known to those who study the history of human development. And I can only say this: either what I have tried to present is a path to truth, not the perfect, complete truth, and in that case people will follow this path, or it is all a path to error, and then it will be overcome. But that doesn't matter. What must not be extinguished within us, and must not be swept away by hasty criticism, is the everlasting striving upward and forward. And this striving alone permeates what I have tried to present to you today as the path that anthroposophically oriented spiritual science wants to pursue. Question: we must have the certain belief that the effort we put forth will be worth it. Is it possible at all to know the spiritual life in and of itself? Dr. Steiner says it is possible to know the spirit of the world, the spirit of all life and of all nature, and to come in contact with it. Is that possible with our spirit, with our thinking? I cannot help doubting this. Thinking consists of imaginations. I think in pictures. Rudolf Steiner. If I were to answer this question in detail, I would have to keep you here a long time. I don't want to do that, and so I will not address it. I only regret that this question has not been asked earlier, because then I could have answered it in more detail. Still, throughout my writings, you can find that I often raise hypothetical objections to my views and then address them. That is, in that literature you can already find the replies to allay your doubts. Here, today, I only want to say the following. Certain people practically make it impossible for themselves to move beyond sensory phenomena because of their preconceived notions. They point to the phenomena and say, what is behind them? That we do not know. Essentially, the entire Kantian philosophy is based on this error. And my whole striving began with trying to refute this error. I want to show you through a comparison how those doubts can be allayed. When you look at a letter of the alphabet, you can say that the individual letter, by itself, points to nothing else than to its own form, and you cannot relate this form to anything else. The form does not tell us anything else. And when I look at electric phenomena, let's say, that is much like looking at an individual letter that doesn't tell me anything. But it's a different matter when we look at several letters in a row that form a word, so that from looking at the individual letters, we naturally move on to reading. We are still just looking at the very same thing as before, but we have now advanced to the level of meaning. This leads us to something very different. And likewise, as long as we are looking at isolated individual phenomena and elements in nature, that is, elements in the sense of mathematical elements, we are right to say that we do not advance to what is in them. However, when we try in this context to invigorate everything, to begin with a new activity, as in the transition from the isolated individual letter to reading an entire word, then everything turns into something different. That is why any true spiritual science is nothing other than phenomenology. But phenomenology that does not stop at combining, synthesizing individual phenomena, but reads the phenomena in their context. It is a phenomenology in which we do not sin against anything by going beyond the phenomena speculatively. Rather, this is a phenomenology that interrogates the phenomena, regarding whether they have something to say for a certain inner activity, not only in isolation but in context. It is understandable that when we look only at the individual isolated phenomena, we might take the standpoint that Haller took when he said in his poem, quote, "Into the heart of nature no created spirit delves. Happy be he to whom she only knows her outer shell." Close quote. But we can also see that someone who understands phenomenology the way Goethe did, and spiritual science is, after all, only a continuation of Goetheanism, would react the way Goethe did upon reading Haller's words, as we read in this poem, quote, "Into the heart of nature. O you Philistine, no created spirit delves. My foot, let no such talk pervert what mine is, and thine. For 60 years I've heard it, over and over again. I do believe, I curse it heartily, but up my sleeve say after me 1,000 times, gladly doth nature give her all, and well, and has no core nor outer shell. All things she is in one. You have just to test the matter on yourself to see it better, whether you be core or shell or none. Know you not what nature poses? A whole universe beneath our noses? Doth not nature's very heart own in the human breast a part? Jakob Hugentobler opens the Disputation evening. A student. A young enthusiastic man would like to study astronomy. He wants to find out what Kepler, Newton, and all the others up to Einstein have come up with. He wants to have a clear picture of what is going on in that field. This person wants to enter into things objectively. He is directed to the field of mathematics, and either must take the trouble of entering into the very complicated states of consciousness of higher mathematics in order to penetrate what scholars such as Gauss and Bayer have produced, or he must stop halfway. Someone in our time can have worked his way through everything. He can have read Plato, Feuerbach, Averroes, for example, and yet still lack certain dispositions of soul that could make a certain knowledge accessible to him. Thus he will have to admit that he has not yet learned anything about those spiritual worlds that Anthroposophy talks about. If he is then told that he must prepare himself in a certain way, he is either motivated or not, as from epistemological and purely psychological standpoints, many different variations and regularities of life are possible. Now, this person thinks he has no right to doubt this or that. He does not mean to offend anyone present, but an aesthetic outlook on life is hardly suited for the perception of something essential. One has to struggle through hardships, and so on, is much closer to the entire movement than those who take up these things merely to pass the time, because they have nothing else to do. Rudolf Steiner. I would like to comment on what the previous speaker has said. It has been emphasized just now, and rightly so, that hardship and suffering indeed mark the path that is to lead into the world characterized by Anthroposophy. Now I want to begin by taking up that last comment. In the course of my lectures I have often made a similar comment, but always I'd like to point out based on some particular context. That is, I have often said that we human beings live our lives alternating between joy and pleasure on the one hand, and pain, suffering, and hardship on the other. With all due humility, if we believe that we have achieved a certain higher knowledge, then we still always have to admit that we highlight, perhaps for a very understandable reason, with too broad a brush stroke, what we have experienced of joy and pleasure in life, and for which we are, of course, grateful to the powers of the world. But we do not owe our knowledge to this. We owe our knowledge, actually, only to the sum of pain we have undergone. Thus, when we speak of knowledge in the true sense of the word, it is indeed something that originates from the sum of pain. But in our outer life, we can in fact undergo the most diverse pains and hardships. Hardships that depress us, and that can at times take away our soul's breath, so to speak. Still, there are also true world-view pains, that is, pains that, I want to say without meaning to hurt anyone's feelings, a large part of humanity does not know much about. The experiences we can have on the path to knowledge are such that they can, at times, take more away than the breath of our soul. And indeed, it was not for nothing that in ages past, and I want to call those people by the name they themselves used, the ancient initiates, the ancient sages, were trained on paths that we can no longer tread. Back then they were indeed guided through pain and suffering, because that was needed to prepare them properly for knowledge. In fact, the hopelessness that assails those who tread the path of knowledge leads to pain and hardship that people can perhaps, with a measure of indifference, handle within themselves. Nevertheless, it is then still necessary that people take their place in life in the way the times demand. In the past few years, I have already emphasized in lectures here in Zurich that the suffering of the times, the hardships of the times, are ultimately connected with what people in recent times have omitted to do in the realm of knowledge. The knowledge that has celebrated the greatest victories recently, and from which all manner of technology already has and can still develop, this knowledge, as far as it insists on limiting itself to the realm of necessities, and does not approach the realm of freedom, of which I spoke in general outline, is not suited to generate social thinking. That is the great task of our times, that we are faced with. We must become able not only to think about nature, which by virtue of its solid structure of necessities guides our thinking about it, but we must also develop the ability to think free thoughts, which have strength because they once again submerge themselves in necessities. For without such free thoughts, our modern civilization will embark upon its decline. We cannot find social ideas if our epistemological foundation is nothing more than what we have in our modern times. It is indeed true that we enter into certain complicated developments of consciousness when we follow the naturalistic strivings of Kepler, Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, on to Einstein. But we must not forget that through all of this, only one-sided paths are opened for us, even though Gauss, for example, already pushed the mathematical beyond the realm of mathematics. In all of this, we do not find those indications pointing us to ideas that can address social hardships. The same is true for the epistemological positions advanced by the likes of Descartes, Mach, and Avenarius. There is still a completely different way that is opened up for us through what anthroposophical spiritual science wants. And indeed the latter is closely connected with what is significant as precisely the sort of knowledge that has recently celebrated great victories in the natural sciences, and that, as I have tried to show today, flows into what the anthroposophical research and view is. What the esteemed previous speaker said about the aesthetic worldview is correct, but perhaps we should consider the term, quote, aesthetic worldview, close quote, more historically. When we look at the thinking that has developed out of the efforts of the natural sciences, then we have to say that it does not sink any roots into the social necessities, that it does not penetrate to the spiritual foundations of existence. This has resulted in a certain mood that has gone extraordinarily deep, especially in the last third of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. Those who have observed how people have begun to be interested in certain higher questions could see people in the widest circles have begun to be interested in higher questions. I just want to point out how very widespread the discussions were that followed Bjornson's title, Beyond Our Power, for example. And I could mention many more examples like this. Thus we can say that a certain interest in the suprasensory world began to take hold, especially in this era. But how? People liked it best to accept things when they were presented in aesthetic form, one could say. That is, people preferred to accept knowledge when they did not have to engage their own capacity for knowing, if I may put it thus, but could receive knowledge as they do in drama or novellas. This means that they could convince themselves that they can get involved in something with their fantasy, just for once. But they did not feel compelled to reconcile things with reality. Indeed, people were glad that they did not have to reconcile anything with reality. Instead, they had a certain desire for sensation, indeed a rather extensive one. This sensationalism developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but people did not want such things to be in any way related to real life. This fleeing from real life has gained more and more ground. This non-connection and not taking entirely seriously the very thing in which one is actually interested, but regarding which one has only a certain hunger for the sensational. This is the very thing that must be taken away from humanity if civilization is to continue, and if we do not want to end up in conditions such as described by Oswald Spengler in his title Decline of Western Civilization. This must happen. Ultimately, it is only a fleeing from the painful aspects of existence, in a certain sense, a flouting of the painful aspect of existence. Clearly, what has emerged in the last third of the 19th century in Friedrich Nietzsche is a tragic phenomenon, as I would like to call it. We do not even have to look closely at what Friedrich Nietzsche said or what his significance is. We need only look at his life. Ladies and gentlemen, just think of the suffering that this soul underwent in 3 sequential developmental phases, and then connect that with contemporary history as a whole. You see, Nietzsche grew up leading a true philologist's life. But unlike other philologists, he did not devote himself to philology out of an outer sense of duty. Rather, he felt the constricting nature of the philological method early on. And out of this sense of constriction, he then chose what flowered initially in the 1860s, and then from the early 1870s until well into that decade in the circles in which Nietzsche lived. He lived into what had originated with Schopenhauer, and what in broad circles in society back then was nothing more than pessimistic talk about the misery in order to dull, to some extent, one's perception of the mystery of life. And Nietzsche suffered from all of this. And it was actually only a yearning to inwardly overcome the unidealistic mood of the times with a certain kind of knowledge. But around the year 1866, Nietzsche suffered from what was back then direct scholarly education. He wanted to set something against this scholarly education in his book titled The Birth of Tragedy and his title Untimely Meditations. These works were written out of deep pain. But by about 1876, Nietzsche had reached the point where he had to admit that this too was merely a covering up, and that he had to go deeper into human nature. And at that point, he had to realize also that human beings actually indulge in many thoughts, in much that is untruthful. And then he wanted to overcome this untruthfulness, first of all, through knowledge. After all, people have preserved ideals for themselves from the ancient past. In the early days of his work, Nietzsche also still believed in these ideals, but ultimately he saw the instincts behind the ideals, and that is what made him write something like title Human, All Too Human. There was then a second form of the development of the times, from which Nietzsche suffered, only to finally arrive at the third form, where he endured the deepest suffering in his soul and felt the emergence of the human out of subordinate natural beings as a burden weighing on his soul. Because he was unable to advance to the spirit, the problem continued to face him. Human beings are only a transition from worms to the superhuman, Übermensch. And that is why Nietzsche, in his book titled Thus Spoke Zarathustra, could express this soul path of human beings only lyrically in his grand conception of the eternal recurrence, in which he could only get a glimpse from afar of what Anthroposophy is to advocate: the repeated earthly lives and also the sequential metamorphoses of the world system. Nietzsche was the person who suffered most deeply from the education of modern times, and who was broken by that modern education. Doubtlessly, at least for me there is no doubt, Nietzsche has provided the proof that the body can be broken by the soul. For it is in any case significant that a famous psychiatrist could say about Nietzsche's illness only that it was an atypical case of paralysis. And the yarns that have since been spun about Nietzsche's illness on the basis of the usual schemas of medicine, well, for people who can really see what was suffered there, what was suffered in the tension of striving to come to a comprehension of the supranatural, for people who look at this objectively, there is no doubt that this tension could break the body. I'd like to say that it can be seen directly how this organism was destroyed in a process that started in the soul, and the external symptoms are also in line with that. Just think of that tragic situation that had developed there. Let me describe it to you. Together with Paul Deussen, who later studied ancient India and philosophy, Nietzsche was a pupil at the secondary school, Gymnasium, in Schulpforta in Thuringia, and the two were good friends. In the 1890s, when Nietzsche was already quite ill, Deussen went to visit him, and as he stood before his friend and talked with him, Nietzsche did not engage in the conversation. Then Deussen spoke of their past, about this and that event from the past. And to this Nietzsche replied, "You know, regarding all this I can tell you that a man was involved in this whom you do not know at all, namely my good friend, dear old Deussen, took part in those events." That is what Nietzsche said to Deussen, who was actually standing there in front of him. What Nietzsche had experienced in his youth was still present to him, but what was going on in his surroundings, in the immediate present, was extinguished. I mention this one scene, there are many more I could add, in order to point something out to you. What was expressed in Nietzsche's pathology could already be detected much earlier in his life. For example, 20 years ago I wrote a treatise entitled, quote, "The Psychopathological Element in Nietzsche's Work," close quote. And there I examined even his earliest writings, which are brilliant and magnificent, but in which one can already detect the dissociation of ideas. Those were ideas that grew entirely out of the fragmenting effect the culture of the time had on those who, out of the center of the human being, wanted to reconcile that culture with the suprasensory realm. And we can say that we see particularly in people who are shattered on the rocks of this culture, and this is what Nietzsche's real problem was, what struggle inner struggle with inner hardship and suffering really is. Actually, the path to knowledge lies in overcoming such suffering. This path was already difficult to tread in the old days, because the aesthetic worldview, which although it is very much and fully justified in its own realm, nevertheless insists on not taking seriously the reality of that for which it has a certain sense, a certain sensationalism. That aesthetic worldview was so widespread in the time when people were fully prepared to work their way from Newton to Einstein, from Descartes to Mach or Avenarius. But for our time it has now become necessary that we work our way to something else, and that is what the path of Anthroposophy offers, namely to something that can be arrived at by everyone. People claim that not everyone can make their way on this path, but we have to take that with a grain of salt. After all, not everyone can make their way into higher mathematics either. And I believe that anyone who not only makes his or her way into higher mathematics, but also to a certain inner understanding of the transition from ordinary geometry and mathematics to synthetic geometry, for example, is also, where his soul situation is concerned, well on the way toward imaginative cognition. We must find our way there, much as we also must find our way into the theory of functions. Of course, we could proceed faster on this path if the prejudices of the times were not always working so much against our progress. For instance, the belief that one needs very special talents and capacities of the spirit in order to advance in Anthroposophy is much more widespread than it deserves. After all, the truth is that every person can advance along this path just as much and as well as he or she can make headway on the other scientific path. And I want to emphasize the following, because it is absolutely true. Hardships and misery lead human beings to the portal of knowledge. But what matters is that they find there not just a certain inner mood, as I'd like to put it, but rather the real spiritual world. Only by knowing this real spiritual world will we become capable of bringing to the social aspect of material life what is needed so much in our time, provided that we are met with understanding, because that is important above all. That is why, on the one hand, we must have understanding for the meaning of pain and suffering, and on the other hand, we must gain understanding for the concrete application of spiritual knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had enough of the general talk about something spiritual in the pantheistic sense. Really, that does not get us anywhere. People who talk only in general terms of a spiritual world and want to give it an epistemological basis are much like those who walk across a meadow and say that they don't care if others point out that this here is an autumn crocus, that over there is a lily, and there's a tulip beyond that, and so on. None of that interests them, because as far as they are concerned, it is all uniformly life. All they see are plants. Likewise, people whose thinking tends toward pantheism always want to exclaim, "Spirit, Spirit, Spirit." We can be satisfied that, at any rate, the Spirit is acknowledged. People can satisfy a certain inner sensuality with this pantheism, with what I call, in quotes, modern mysticism. However, what the world needs today is concrete knowledge about the suprasensory worlds, and that is precisely what Anthroposophy is most often resented for, even today. Namely, that it strives to attain this concrete knowledge. And for that reason, some people try to vilify it as being much like the movements of mysticism. Those who want to look at Anthroposophy more closely will soon see that it really follows paths, albeit ones that we must first open up for ourselves, that allow it to give an account of itself to even the most rigorous sciences. That is what I wanted to say in connection with the very interesting comments of the previous speaker. Another speaker speaks. When I first heard about spiritual science, I took it serious in its entirety, I would say. In the lecture today, I had the feeling that I was hearing a scientific lecture. Such a scientific lecture could have been attended by scientists. But what if I am a painter or musician and must work productively in my field? The lecture could have been attended by someone who wants to attain knowledge of the natural sciences in the higher scientific sense. My question now is, shouldn't anthroposophy be understood in a much wider, more comprehensive sense? And I would also like to know how we should relate to anthroposophy in practical terms. Is it sufficient if one has some kind of profession, some mission in life? Is it sufficient if one acquires this knowledge? Or is it necessary that one pursues also that path into the spiritual worlds for oneself? The path Dr. Steiner has described. I would like to ask how we should conduct ourselves in this regard. Rudolf Steiner. Allow me to make a preliminary remark. In the last lecture that has been announced here, I will be speaking about the building in Dornach, not just in terms of the outer building, but in such a way that the lecture will surely be especially interesting for painters and sculptors, and of course also for all people in general. It is indeed an appropriate analogy to compare what we can attain in anthroposophy with climbing a mountain. We can start from many different points at the bottom, but we will still always reach the same summit. Likewise, in our development, each of us can start from a different point. And we still like to do so even if we have already started from one starting point. We have built that building in Dornach because we wanted to put something there, something artistic, that is the expression of our anthroposophical worldview, just as the nutshell is the expression of the nut. If you have any sense for morphology, you will realize that the nut cannot have any other shell than the one it actually has. The same formative forces are contained in the shell as in the edible part of the nut itself. Now, when the anthroposophical worldview is represented in our Goetheanum in Dornach, then to me the former is the actual nut, the other is only the shell. That means that we had to build out of the same impulse, out of which we speak inside the building, for example. It is indeed true that one can start from any of the many, very different points. For example, we can follow up further on what Dr. Kalisko presented here today about the threefold nature of the human being. The peculiar thing here is that when you pursue that matter further, after all, as Dr. Kalisko said, in a lecture these things can only be mentioned briefly, you will see that you basically enter a condition of soul that is very different from the one you started with. The principles that are explained there are so deeply rooted in real life that in their logical progression, they not only lead people to certain conclusions, but also really work in their soul. And when we put these things that are real principles into practice, we find that real forces come alive in our soul. Ultimately, this is how we attain a vision of the human form. What at first seems to be a theory, then changes all by itself into a sculptural view of the human form. And that is how we come to know and understand the human form from the inside. This is how we tried to work in the sculptures at the Goetheanum in Dornach, in order to comprehend the human form from the inside. Yes, and there is still more to it. For instance, we have also tried to deal with the material. In the process, we come to realize the principles of spatial design. Thus, it is particularly interesting to discover, through working with one's hands, that when sculpting a human head, for example when sculpting an eye, there is a great difference between one material, such as clay or marble, and another material, such as wood. That is, we understand clearly that you have to shape or scrape wood. What matters is that you work into the concave. When working with clay, however, you must work into the convex. As you sculpt or work with a solid material, you must always focus on working into the convex. In contrast, when working with soft wood, what matters is that you scrape things out of the wood. In this way, something that looked at first like a theory changes, I would say all by itself, into a certain artistic design, into an immersion in those formative forces of which we want to say they are the formative forces of nature itself. And that is the inner transition between what we have as a starting point and the point we ultimately arrive at. For example, the transition to the artistic realm. What is typical of anthroposophy is that it does not stop at a particular soul situation, but instead leads us into quite different soul situations. And in understanding the human being, we initially find the transition starting from anatomy and physiology, which work abstractly or at most in a sensory and illustrative way, and arriving at the human being's inner creative forces. That is, science becomes artistic vision. That transition indeed exists, and then we encounter something grand, and we can have the feeling that nature itself is an artist, not just metaphorically speaking, but in the true and real sense of the word. That is how we find our way into the artistic realm. People, the epistemologists, will say, fine, but knowledge must be gained in a logical progression. Knowledge must not operate in some eidetic way, using images as described here. Instead, knowledge must progress by conclusions. It must progress along the guided thread of logic. Well, fine, but that is only a subjective demand. If nature does not work in the way we dictate to it, then thanks to our logic we completely miss and fail to grasp the deeper meaning of nature. Thus we can only get close to nature by entering in complete impartiality into this metamorphosis of the soul situation. That is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the transition to the practical realm. You see, I wrote the book entitled Toward Social Renewal, and it is indeed widely read these days. However, the understanding has not progressed very far yet. Otherwise, people would realize that the book was not written for reading. Forgive me for putting it so paradoxically. Rather, the book was written so that people would do what is set forth there, that they would do it in some way, each in his or her own way, depending on his or her situation. The book was actually written based only on observation and experience, with the focus entirely on the practical. Of course, you have to express yourself with words and sentences, but these are used only to point at what is actually meant. And that is where the transition to direct practice is. And that is what anthroposophy actually wants to be. Anthroposophy leads into all the practical areas of life just as naturally as it leads us into the realm of the artistic. It leads us into dexterity and agility, and ultimately in this way we arrive at things that some people consider quite open to question and contestation. Some people believe certain truths must be expressed differently. But as I have often said in my lectures, I cannot imagine that anyone who is a good philosopher would not also be a good chemist or a good sorter of potatoes. It is actually not possible for anyone to discourse logically on concepts and ideas without also being able to chop wood when it counts, or perhaps even when it doesn't count. I believe that if we are fully present with our whole being, when we are chopping wood or digging potatoes, for example, then we do the job perhaps more skillfully, or at least learn just as much logic as we do in logical college seminars. That may seem paradoxical to you, but nevertheless, that's how it is. And that is above all what anthroposophy wants to assert. There is something unified, something concretely and consistently unified in everything. Therefore, I want to answer your question positively by saying that when you look around among what we already have nowadays in the various fields of knowledge, you will certainly find points of contact somewhere, and starting from there, you can arrive anywhere. Anthroposophy does not want to be one-sided. It is possible to begin at the wrong end, but through what we strive for as human beings, we still eventually end up with the right things, even though initially we may have felt that none of this concerned us at all. The main thing is that the will to keep going from where we are, if starting out is to have any meaning at all. And that is where the window opens for me to come to my point. Because anthroposophy is far from any pedantry, it should be understood in such a way that one can start with it at any point, wherever one wants, and still reach a goal. For example, you could start from reflections, such as the ones provided in my book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. And if you go far enough along on that path, you can reach any area from there. Or you can start from a more scientific perspective. For example, one like that presented by Dr. Kalisko in his lecture earlier. And when you start there, you can still arrive at what you need. The previous speaker explains that he had something very specific in mind. He thinks it is logical that we can reach the summit from any point. He wants to take an example from the artistic community. For instance, a person could be a sculptor or a painter. Both could give rise to the deep art we already have today, for example, Expressionism and Futurism. But he found that no universal human being, such as Goethe, emerges even when we work our way into anthroposophy and live in what anthroposophists and even the genuine Rosicrucians have, namely the ascent to the level of Devachan. Now the speaker wonders whether it is necessary to follow specifically this path, to work one's way up to those realms, purely with one's soul, intellectually, or if one could also start from another philosophical direction. Rudolf Steiner. If we use the examples you have mentioned, namely Expressionism, Futurism, and so on, I would like to say that all of this can sometimes appear to us today as a bit childish, paradoxical, and so on. Nevertheless, I want to point out that in all of this there is an impulse. I don't want to say that it is always healthy, but rather that it is a justified impulse. And this is an impulse for a turning back from the materialistic perception of the world and toward the spiritual realm. I don't want to speak now only about the theoretical materialism, but what I mean is the materialistic feeling or perception of the world. And even starting from this perspective, through many attempts that compared to Goethe's universal genius may appear very one-sided, we can still find something that has a future. But it takes time, and we must allow ourselves that time. In my view, these things have a future. You see, I have to look at it in this way. An expressionist painter of today, for example, may paint a picture in such a way that you won't be able to tell whether it is a picture of a house or a tree stump or perhaps an elephant or something like that. But you see, if I may express this paradoxically, this is basically never an artistic question. To ask what the picture is supposed to represent is indeed not an artistic question. At least, it is not the first question to be asked. Rather, the question should be why we have this color on this background, and so on. And with that, we then come to questions where we see that we are dealing here with something that is, of course, not as universal as Goethe was, but that still has a future. Perhaps you'll allow me to draw your attention to the following. If I may make a personal comment, I have studied Goethe thoroughly for 40 years, and my first writing endeavor was focused on Goethe, and since then I have never left that field of study. Now, at a certain time, in quotes, Goethe problems began to interest me. Those are the problems where Goethe did not finish something, and there are actually many things he did not complete. For example, just think of his drama titled Pandora, or his verse drama titled The Natural Daughter, and also something like his drama titled Nausicaa, and so on. Clearly there are many things Goethe did not finish. Goethe had an inwardly honest nature, and not finishing something for him meant wriggling or winding his way up to a certain point at which he then had to let things stand. He could not find his way through. He could not break through. It is very interesting to see how he came to a certain point with title Pandora. What followed after that, for the most part, were only sketches. He had wanted to continue with Pandora, had wanted to carry out what we find indicated in the sketches. We can say that he could have let the poem stand and then later developed the sketches further, but that would not have worked. For if he had written it even 8 days later, it would have become something completely different. And there is no reason to say Goethe should have worked following such a sketch. He would only have changed the whole thing again. Yes, he reached a point where he could not go on, and we can well understand why this was so. It was in fact because Goethe had advanced greatly in the contemplation of a certain outer metamorphosis. It is indeed magnificent to see how Goethe developed this concept of metamorphosis on his Italian journey, and how he applies it to the human being. But he was not able to actually enter into the formation of the spiritual. And why was that? Why could he not advance to the point where the spiritual works on and shapes matter? This, after all, lies in the direct line of Goethe's thoughts on metamorphosis. I don't hesitate to express these things, for they are part and parcel of what I call not only my conviction, but indeed my knowledge, no matter what people may make of this. If we follow that metamorphosis thought in a straight line, it will lead us directly to the realization that the formative forces underlying the human head today are the metamorphosed formative forces of the organism, with the exception of the head, from a former earthly life. Thus we can understand the strange shape of the skull in relation to the rest of the human organism as resulting from an extensive, far-reaching metamorphosis. But Goethe was not able to break through to the spiritual realm. This is evident from the fact that he had to stop at the very point where he should have become spiritual. He was very honest. He stopped there. Just look at the second part of title Faust. It too is simply not fully finished. This is really how it is. The drama is not fully finished because in the final scenes Goethe took the Catholic concepts and terms and wedged all that in there. The drama became something magnificent in this way, but it still is something outwardly added on, grafted on. And when we compare the ending of Faust with certain other things, we'll see the effort Goethe made there, the power he exerted there in order to finish the drama. And yet this most contestable, abstract end phase is the moment where we come to the breakthrough to the spiritual. Even though people cannot yet do it, it is in any case a beginning, and that is why we are justified in saying these things. And that is why I believe I can say that if people were honest with themselves, they would be able to do something today from the various starting points in their immediate vicinity. For example, I believe the most natural way would be for people to start from where they stand at the moment and then join together for productive purposes. People should start from whatever field they are involved in. They will then eventually come together. It is not that important if at first people don't understand each other. From a certain point on, they will understand. It is a matter then of watching for the right moment, and destiny surely watches for those moments. But though I have experienced much in this regard, I cannot find that these abstract contortions, please forgive me for saying this so bluntly, that these acrobatics of springing from one plane to the next are particularly promising for human beings. Really, in most cases, these acrobatics do not come from complete inner honesty. Granted, it is possible to achieve something in this way, but generally people end up becoming estranged from the world in the process. And that is something that is least needed in our times, in these current difficult times. I don't mean this at all in a frivolous sense, but this is how it is. I want to put it like this. These acrobatics from one plane to the next are so intermixed with coquetry, with so much inner untruthfulness, that I think we must strive for everyone to start from the point where he or she is standing firmly, on solid ground, and then people will also find each other. In a way, this approach has proven itself in practice. You see, some of us are artists or doctors, like, for example, Dr. Kalisko, and others are philologists, and perhaps you will hear one of them during this course, and others are mathematicians, and yet others are through and through practical people. We have practical people among us, who are simply striving to set up the most practical arrangements possible in which the anthroposophical spirit can live. For example, Kommerzienrat, business counselor Molt, is with us today, and he, above all, has made efforts in this direction. You'll agree, I believe, that what we are dealing with today is actually a problem of the times, and that is why it is necessary that we start from the point where we are standing today, and then seek understanding with others. That is indeed something that has already proven to be practical, and that I consider to be promising. But in an unworldly striving to ascend to the higher worlds, I cannot see anything that is truly honest. It is indeed true that we can understand the world only if we strive for this understanding. But it is also true that those who start from some definite area of life are more certain to achieve that higher view. Above all, they will achieve it much more concretely. They can then tell us something about the higher worlds, because they will know what things look like in those worlds. It is to their benefit to have started from a definite sphere of life, but the unworldly ascent does not lead to anything really good, at least not for humanity as a whole, though it may lead to something for the individual. I am saying this based on what corresponds to evolution through time. I am most definitely not opposed to anyone pursuing higher development and capacities for suprasensory knowledge. Indeed, I have described how this should take place. But I think that in that process, people should not neglect the sphere of life in which they are placed. This is true everywhere. Another participant in the discussion. Mr. Heisler mentioned in his lecture that Dr. Steiner presumes to have had insights into the higher worlds, and that he possibly even used Goethe as proof of this. I want to say first that I have not yet read any of Steiner's writings, and I would now like to ask whether having knowledge of a deceased person, for example, whether the deceased is in agony, is not also a certain proof for the existence of God. Those who have studied Nietzsche and who have perhaps lost their faith in God for a long time might inwardly have an easier time of it if they could reclaim their faith through the way in which Dr. Steiner speaks about God. This occult issue has been taken up again by many different people. For example, by Schrenk-Notzing in Munich, as well as by others. Rudolf Steiner. In my lecture today, I could only hint at certain things, but I want to say the following in response to that comment. You see, we are now living in an era in which some people strive to open up a veritable chasm between knowledge and faith. Some of them consider only those sciences healthy that deal with the purely factual, with registering, systematizing, establishing laws. That is, the purely factual. In contrast, others in the sphere of religion believe they must demand faith to uphold their sphere. Still, all this is just a characteristic of a temporary era. Just as in earlier ages, people subdivided the soul into many different soul forces, so people in our times split it into a sphere of knowing and another one of faith. But when our soul is totally honest with itself, it cannot really bear this split. We'll understand what we're dealing with here when we see the reason for this split. You see, these days you can still talk with many people about life after death, or about divine cosmology, if you are talking on the basis of faith. That is, you can do so as long as you are not appealing in any way, and this sort of appeal is found least of all in religions, to those inner powers of persuasion that lead to proof. By talking about life after death, you naturally appeal to people's wishes, their feelings of fear, and so on. Things are very different when you talk about what I spoke about today. namely about pre-existence, about human life, our soul spiritual life before birth, or let's say before conception. This is what Anthroposophy talks about most extensively. In Anthroposophy, we focus more on prenatal life, that is, on human life before conception, on pre-existing life, from which follows, as a matter of course, life after death. We focus more on this life before birth because human egotism is less involved there. It is not a matter of indifference to people whether they go on living after death or not, but out of their egotism they are less interested in whether they have already lived before they came to life on earth. Of course, once we open the sources of knowledge about that life on the other side of birth, the life we lived before we came into earthly life, then the other life, the one after death, follows logically. When you read my writings, you will find this described in detail. Indeed, in Anthroposophy, we consider the reality of this life before birth as more or less a matter of course. But at the same time, something else emerges. Based on a certain belief, we can talk about the life after death. But as I said, this plays to people's egotism and is based on egotistical knowledge. When you talk to people about their pre-existent life, they will be led at the same time on the path of knowledge into the spiritual suprasensory world. And that is why turning our attention to the pre-existent life overcomes the chasm between faith and knowledge, the chasm that is so damaging to the human soul. You see, ancient worldviews indeed give us a certain instinctive knowledge of these things, one which we can no longer strive for. Instead, we must strive for conscious knowledge. I have to emphasize again and again that Anthroposophy concerns itself intensively with our pre-existent life and even talks of repeated lives on earth. And when Lessing, in his treatise titled The Education of the Human Race, took up the idea of repeated earthly lives, he asked, though this idea of repeated lives on earth emerged in the earliest times of history, is it for this reason any less valuable? Is it less valuable just because it appeared in the most ancient times, before it was corrupted by all kinds of schools? You see, the literary researchers and the like of our time take this, let's say, aesthetically. They do not hold this idea in high regard and do not want to see it as a reality. And so they say that Lessing was a great writer, but that his Education of the Human Race is clearly a work of his declining years. Lessing was indeed a great man, and when we read between the lines, we find that he has always held to the idea of repeated lives on earth. It is true, we develop knowledge of the suprasensory world and also concrete knowledge of the spiritual realm, of the spiritual leadership of the world in general, by concerning ourselves with the life before birth, and not just with the life after death. But this fact has gradually been completely lost in recent times, and we can see this clearly in an external phenomenon I will point out to you. You see, we have the word immortal, and with the proper preparation, we speak of immortality. We have the term immortality, but we do not have a word unbornness or unbornity. For just as truly as we live on after death and are immortal, so also are we truly unborn. We need to have a separate term for this unbornness that is just as common as the term immortality. But we do not have such a word. For in our civilization, people have completely turned away from understanding immortality, and it will only be understood again if we can look at being unborn in the same way we consider being immortal. For just as at one pole of life the soul at death is released into the spiritual world, so at the other pole, namely birth, or rather conception, the soul comes again into the physical world. And just as the soul does not die, so it also is not born. Belief only becomes actual knowledge when we come to see this pre-existent life. That is how we make progress. Our suprasensory life must concern itself with pre-existence, and thus lead us on to the path that really brings us to our goal. Regarding the comment that anthroposophy is allegedly presumptuous, well, that depends on how one sees things, doesn't it? For example, until 1827, the Catholic Church considered it highly inappropriate to admit that there once was a man called Copernicus who said that the earth moves around the sun. In other words, it was not until 1827 that Catholics were allowed to believe that. Today, the mainstream sciences have not yet given us permission to believe in repeated earthly lives, just as back then people were not allowed to believe in the earth's movement around the sun. Of course, we can bide our time and wait until these people permit us to believe and hold to those things that are given to us, in particular through anthroposophy. Until then, we have to bear the allegation of presumptuousness. That's just the way of the world. Question: what does anthroposophy stand on vaccinations against epidemics? Rudolf Steiner. In terms of content, this question does not fit really well with what was said earlier, but I will try to comment on it anyway. After all, this is how it is. We must, of course, as has already been said, by no means believe that anthroposophy disparages the successes that have been achieved in modern natural sciences and in medicine. There are many cases proving that the success that was to be achieved by means of vaccination, for example by means of smallpox vaccination, has indeed been achieved. It is a fact that the number of cases of infectious diseases has been greatly reduced thanks to more or less necessary external measures, such as hygiene, as well as through vaccinations. But many vaccinations have not been what we could call successful against other diseases. Still, we have to admit the overall efficacy of the principle of vaccination. On the other hand, this question is also something that could be looked at more in terms of psychology. There are many opponents to vaccination these days. These opponents to immunization are generally parties not psychologically accessible by means of a rational approach. These are people who act out of an inner resistance against the way medicine tries to be effective here. Based on their knowledge, they cannot say that immunization methods are ineffective because there are indeed proven effects. And those who fight against vaccinations fight out of a certain unconscious motivation against these immunization methods. Anthroposophy, however, must start from deeper, much more profound considerations. When we think of the nature of illness in connection with what has been presented to you here today, especially regarding repeated earthly lives, and when we are convinced that we have repeated lives on earth, then we also have to connect the illnesses people undergo in the present life with what they have experienced in a previous life on earth. Once we have grasped this, once we are willing to realize this, regardless of what epidemiology is saying about infectious diseases, then we have to understand that there is a certain connection between what people have undergone in an earlier earthly life and what is happening now when those same people are exposed to a certain infection. We usually say that something happens by chance. People do not want to admit that out of their subconscious they are driven to where they then come into contact with an infectious disease. Aside from what people can experience because of this, we can still come to many other views of all that is connected with the disease. For one thing, we realize that certain illnesses have something to do with the peculiarities of a particular human soul, that the illnesses are, in a certain sense, an overcoming or conquest of what that person could not achieve in a previous life. That is, the physical processes of the illness that must be endured are a compensation, a balancing. After all, the illness also comes with soul or psychological symptoms. Then we can also understand why some people, out of unconscious instinctive motivations, resist this panacea. Unconsciously, their argument is that as far as the illness is concerned, healing of the external symptoms should be paralleled by an inner further development of the soul toward the spiritual. And even if the vaccination used makes it possible for things to work out just as intended, we would still have to say that even if through the appropriate measures all epidemics were extinguished and the number of illnesses reduced, the question is nevertheless whether something else is not also necessary, that in a way must come to meet this process. Namely, that an inner development of the soul toward the spiritual must take place at the same time. People would have to understand that such a method is possible. We can acknowledge and respect everything the sciences say, but we must be clear about the necessity that in addition to the external healing methods we have, there must be something else that moves the soul forward on its inner path and points to earlier spiritual connections, to earlier lives. Anthroposophy will never say anything against what the natural sciences bring us. Question: how can we develop an imagination? Where can we find its content if we are not to link it to a sensory conception or a memory? Rudolf Steiner: that is based on a misunderstanding. I said that what is to be used to meditate and what then leads to imagination should be clear and easily understandable. It should be straightforward and be manageable so that no reminiscences come up and so our subconscious does not get involved in the relevant process of the soul. You see, if you recall a past experience and then meditate, you will find that many elements you have more or less disregarded are living in the image of such an experience. These elements emerge from the subconscious, and as a result you no longer move fully in what you intended. What matters is whether it is all under control and manageable. For example, you can meditate by calling up before your soul a circle with a triangle inscribed in it. What matters is that your soul does the exercises with something it can manage, something that is straightforward and easy to comprehend. You can also meditate on something qualitative. If we let such straightforward, understandable things rest in our soul in order to meditate on them, then we do not run the risk of having reminiscences rise up from our subconscious. The point is not that we should not use something plausible to our senses, or some recollection or reminiscence for our meditation. Indeed, we can use either, but only as long as it remains understandable and straightforward. We should not use anything that then evokes all kinds of conscious or unconscious processes. What matters is the straightforwardness, not whether we imagine this or that arbitrary thing that could represent or mean anything. For example, if you meditate on the concept in quotes, city, you have experienced so much in life, have so many associations with the concept city, that you cannot easily know beforehand what will emerge in your meditation. Another example has also been reported in the relevant literature. A nature researcher crosses the street in a city and comes to stand in front of a shop window. He stands there and gazes into the shop window, and there sees the title page of a treatise on earthworms, a subject that surely must be of interest to him, no? But while he stands there gazing and sees the book on the anatomy of earthworms, he suddenly has to smile. A naturalist who suddenly smiles while looking at a book on earthworms. He himself finds it very unlikely that he should be smiling at this moment, and he wants to know how that happened. He turns away, completely away, closes his eyes, and then tries, in the dark, to understand why he was smiling. And, lo and behold, he hears the sounds of a barrel organ in the far distance. He had completely ignored the sound earlier, both unconsciously as he was walking along, and even consciously and deliberately when he was looking at the book. But the sounds have nevertheless reached his ears lived in a way within him and brought a smile to his lips, albeit an unconscious one. So now he hears the barrel organ and finds it plays the same melody to which he had learned to dance 30 years ago. Since then, he had never thought again of that important event, of having learned to dance to this melody. Still, that event continued to live in his soul, in such a way that now he had to smile, even as the researcher of nature that he now is. You see, there is much that lies in our subconscious, and I could tell you that there are mystics who hear angels, and this can indeed be true and real. But for many a mystic who thinks he hears something in the world of angels, what is actually happening, because these things remain in the subconscious, not only as reminiscence, but also undergo metamorphoses, is that the supposed angel voices are metamorphosed sounds of a barrel organ. Indeed, many things that seem to us significant revelations are actually only metamorphosed sounds of a barrel organ. This is what we must know above all. The anthroposophical method is an absolutely safe and certain method. The more we ascend into the spiritual world, the more will we fight off anything that arising from the things themselves can mislead and confuse us. Thus, it is not a matter of meditating on things that are not straightforward or understandable, and that we cannot manage. What matters is that we meditate on things that have been put together for us by someone who understands these things, or that we ourselves have chosen a content we can manage or control. What matters is how we look at a triangle, for example, of which we know that it has 3 sides and 3 angles, the sum of which is 180 degrees. We can contemplate this without much of anything emerging from our subconscious. This is how straightforward and clear our meditations must be, so that we avoid descending from what we have willingly chosen into the involuntary and automatic, into the unconscious. We want to avoid something coming up that is merely memory, or that was at one time a sensory perception, as in our example of the faraway sounds of a barrel organ. Instead, what has to be present in our consciousness must be something that is as straightforward and as readily comprehensible as a mathematical concept. That is, what we can use to practice imaginative cognition. Of course, we have to think in a materialistic way of everything that arises out of our memory. What matters is not so much that it has developed out of memory, but more that whatever we meditate on must be readily comprehensible. A participant in the discussion. Dr. Kalisko mentioned something today that greatly interests me. When he spoke of the 3 centers, he said, in a way, that the head consumes everything that rises up as vital life force from the lower organs. That is, the organs in our lower body always produce something living, something that the head then, so to speak, devours. I would like to know how Anthroposophy thinks of the actual physical body. In talking about Nietzsche, Dr. Steiner mentioned today that the physical body broke Nietzsche's soul. That is, his soul was not strong enough to overcome the body. From a general standpoint, without having the physical body, I have heard about this from one direction. I have learned about the method of Dr. Hanisch. What use is it for me if I attain knowledge of higher worlds and have a toothache? If I cannot help myself when I have a toothache, what good is it to me then to know something of the spiritual world? Should we approach mastery over the physical body from the material or from the spiritual direction? Eugen Kalisko. First of all, we have to be clear about the nature of the human being, because only then can we understand what human health and sickness really consist of. When you ask what good it is for you to know something of the overall world context while you still have a toothache and are prone to all kinds of other illnesses, well, then we have to say that this is a very one-sided way to look at this. We can apply to this view what we have talked about earlier, namely that human egotism is present in great measure when people say they do not want anything to do with the spiritual realm because such knowledge does not free them from their toothache. Knowledge is something that we have to experience, that drives us not to let go, something we have to continue with even while overcoming a toothache. Therefore, such a point of view that is completely saturated with a kind of materialistic, egotistic striving, even when talking about suprasensory worlds, cannot really be recognized or accepted. But what is important is that we first of all grasp the nature of the human being in order to get beyond the materialistic conceptions about how to care for the body. We cannot take care of our body and we cannot work therapeutically if we do not have any insights into the interconnections of forces that make up the nature of the human body. Rudolf Steiner. I would like to add a few comments to this and illustrate them with examples. You probably know the widely used saying that there are countless illnesses, but only one health. I think there is nothing more wrong than this saying. Indeed, there are countless illnesses, but there are also countless healths. Each person, however healthy, has his or her own health, and such blustering is not acceptable under any circumstances. It is indeed correct to say, even from the most spiritual standpoint, that human beings must in every way look after the health of their organism. I myself, as a result of my research, have come to the point of looking at the life of the imagination, for example, in such a way that I consider it a radical error to believe that the activity of the brain as such can in any way be the basis for the activity of the spirit. The way I see it, this is an error I would like to characterize in more detail with the following example. Let us assume that there is a street that is all soggy and sodden from rain. People have walked on this street, and their footsteps left marks in the softened road surface. And then someone says that this road is configured in a certain way, as you can see in the various lines, tracks, and so on. All of this must have been caused by forces that come up from below. It is all caused by something that is down there, inside the earth. When you hear this, you will of course readily reply that this is nonsense. The tracks have been embedded in the road from the outside and not from below. Likewise, spiritual science naturally leads me to see the brain configuration and the configurations of the nerves, which have been shown to us by physiologists, as indeed truly existing. But those configurations have been engraved there by the life of the soul and spirit, which leave their imprint in the brain. But at the same time, it is a matter of then understanding that this entire bodily existence between birth and death is the solid ground on which consciousness develops, that it is, for that development, a solid substrate, offering a sort of resistance or counter-support. Otherwise, we could not develop the life of the imagination. In order to be able to reflect back, the imagination needs that substrate. A mirror needs a backing board. Clearly, then, even from the most spiritual standpoint, it is important to keep our physical organization as healthy as possible. And here it is a question of developing true views of what a healthy physical constitution really is. And only this is what we mean when we have attained a more comprehensive way of looking at this through spiritual science. I want to give you a few examples for this, not to show off, but just to indicate what the foundation is for my view of life, which I developed based on spiritual knowledge. About 36 years ago, I was recommended to a family as a private teacher for a young boy. Among the 4 sons in that family, there was one, back then about 11 years old, who in everyone's view was especially unfortunate, also in the family's prejudiced view. The family was unhappy about the boy because at the age of 11, when he had to take an exam in school, he could produce nothing but a great hole in the paper from using his eraser so much. And that's what this 11-year-old boy's knowledge in all school subjects was like. His mother was deeply unhappy. His father was somewhat skeptical and wary. The family doctor, who was one of the most excellent practical doctors I have ever met, he was indeed a great man, had already given up on the boy. Well, I was hired to teach the other 3 boys in the family. I observed the 11-year-old and then told his mother, the only one in the whole family who out of her motherly heart still had some understanding for the boy, that although I could not promise anything, I would like to use all my skills, to the extent I had any, to make something of him. The other family members said the doctor had already given up on the boy, and they looked at me as though they were not sure I could be entrusted with the education of the other 3 boys after all, now that they had heard my view of the 4th boy. But the boy's mother prevailed. It really took some doing and persevering on her part before the boy was then given into my care. I had told them that I would have to have absolutely free rein to do as I saw fit. The boy suffered from very severe hydrocephalus. He was really in poor shape. Now, I basically applied only spiritual hygiene in a methodical way. In fact, I applied only what I would like to call economy in teaching concepts, skills, and so on. I stipulated that the boy should be allowed to listen to as much piano music as I determined, that he was allowed to have other things to the extent I decided. Indeed, I can say that sometimes I studied for 3 hours to prepare to work for 15 minutes with the boy. And it is through such a spiritual and pedagogical hygiene that after 2 years, the boy was able to transition to the gymnasium, high school. His head had actually become smaller. Now, you may say that his condition might have improved on its own anyway. But really, that is not the point. The point is not that he might have improved on his own. The boy really had a severe case of hydrocephalus, and in all the years before, his head just would not get smaller. Even if he had survived for those 2 years, despite the hydrocephalus, without the intervention, he would certainly not have been able to go to high school after those 2 years, especially considering the results that had been achieved with him up to that point. The important thing really was that through 2 years of intensive work, specifically such individual care with hygienic, attentive care for the boy's organism that was in total disarray and had to be treated, the boy was brought to that level of achievement. This is not a matter of general rules, even though some may be quite correct, but of intimate knowledge of the nature of the human being as such. Regarding the claim that only a healthy body can be the expression of a healthy soul, now, if we were to translate this claim into real life, it would not be true at all. Here's another example. A renowned physician came to me one day and told me about a case he was treating that interested him very much. He said a patient had consulted him who had had a fall quite some time ago. In that fall he had broken his nasal bone, and as a result his nose was somewhat crooked. This doctor wanted to operate on the patient, but first wanted to talk about this with me. After all, with a certain deeper insight into the nature of the human being, one does see things differently than people necessarily see them who look at health only from the outside. All I could say to that doctor was to advise him not to operate, for here is a rare stroke of luck. The man now gets just the amount of air that his lungs can tolerate. His nasal passages now have just the right width he needs for his special case, for his constitution. And this must be left as it is for him. After all, the man obviously was basically doing well with the slightly crooked nose. There are many other examples I could list here, but the general principle is entirely correct. We must work toward health for our body, but we must do so in quite different ways, in individual cases. This may seem strange, but I have often noticed this among naturopaths. They will often claim that this or that individual has something, for example, that there is something irregular in the movement of the person's heart and that this must be treated and cured. But if we look more closely, we often have to say in such cases, leave it alone. Let the man have his heart abnormality. That may be just right for him, and if you try to cure him of this, he will surely get all the sicker. Because people have a certain pattern or template in mind, much that is unnecessary is done in this way. We often see that people use general methods that are not much different, at least not as far as the logic of the matter, the logic of facts, is concerned, than those applied in the case of a woman who was a faith healer. That was awful. She said all kinds of things that people were supposed to imagine and believe in order to become strong and healthy. She said people would become hardy and toughened up that way. But I have never met anyone who looked so pitiful and miserable as that faith healer, despite the fact that she always took great care that not even the slightest breeze would touch her, because the least bit of a draught caused her the most horrible symptoms, she said. You see, these are things that we should look at as they really are, and not just based on a certain predefined notion, a template, let's say. It is entirely true, on the one hand, that we must work toward physical health as much as possible, but insight into what health really is must come from spiritual knowledge. That is, we not only have to look after our own health ourselves, but even more importantly, we also must be aware that we are a part of the cosmos. As you know, the air that is now inside us was out there in the cosmos just a short time ago. And this applies to everything else also. We as human beings must look at the world from the perspective of what we are, a part of the cosmos. Of course, these general things can only be interpreted in this way, and I just wanted to point out a few things with these explanations. Jakob Hugentobler thanks the audience and lectures and closes the meeting. Walter Burkett, Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Steiner for the lecture he has presented here, and I want to announce that a discussion is to follow now. Please turn in requests to speak and your questions here in writing. Dr. Dobrina. Ladies and gentlemen, after such a powerful picture of the current and past spiritual and intellectual history of humanity has been presented to us, it is not easy to sum everything up concisely in a few succinct words. But I think before going on to a critique, we must first appreciate the profundity of what we have heard. We must appreciate and thus acknowledge that a synthesis is being sought here of the natural sciences with their exact lines of thought and spiritual science with its somewhat antiquated forms. Indeed, the natural sciences have been able in the past centuries to mount the throne and to dethrone even philosophy as in part antiquated. But now those who are not satisfied with philosophy, thus toppled, and thrown out of the realm of the gods, are looking for an impulse to bring philosophy back onto the old podium on which it stood in ancient Greece. And I believe that anthroposophy, as Dr. Steiner described it here, is an attempt to shape that synthesis in such a way that in the first preliminary stages he acknowledges the natural sciences and makes an effort not to say anything against their exactness, in order to then move beyond them and advance them into the suprasensory realm. That step into the suprasensory worlds seems to me to rest on a weak foundation, and all the more so as Dr. Steiner works with concepts such as pre-existence. If there were more time available, one could ask more pointedly about what Dr. Steiner means by this pre-existence, or what nonsense he might still have to say about the post-mortem life, the life after death. And there is applause. Dr. Dobrina continues. At any rate, I believe that from this standpoint we can and must right away begin a strong discussion with him. And in the course of the discussion, it will become clear that Dr. Steiner's entire concept formation falls really into two entirely different spheres. On the one hand, he makes an effort to plunge into therapy and to examine Hellenism, in particular, with regard to therapeutic analysis. On the other hand, he works with concepts taken out of the old toolbox of theosophy, and strongly reminiscent of quite antiquated forms of spiritual life. Applause again. Dr. Dobrina continues. For this reason, I want to say very briefly that the total picture that Dr. Steiner presented in his lecture here, as well as in his previous public lecture, seems rather inadequate to me, and that on this basis we cannot come to any critique of modern life, or of the struggles in the economy, or of the now prevalent opinion against spiritual powers that have fallen into decay. Applause again. And Dr. Dobrina continues. Perhaps Dr. Steiner will be so kind as to respond to this briefly. Walter Berkigt. Do those assembled take these statements as a question that Dr. Steiner should address right away? If so, I would like to ask Dr. Steiner to please respond to these statements. And there's applause. And now, Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the beginning, my lecture today was intended merely as an introduction. And as I said, in an introductory lecture, one faces the difficulty of only being able to indicate and suggest points that really need further explanation and clarification. And as a result, of course, a whole flood of unsatisfactory and unanswered points accumulates in the souls of the listeners that cannot all be resolved or clarified in the first lecture. The previous speaker's comments, I can't call them objections, concern the fact that he found the terms I used to be old concepts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all our words, even the most ordinary ones, can be included in this category. When we want to express ourselves, to speak at all, we must use words. If you try to survey what is available in the literature of our day, which seems colossal even to me, I mean colossal here in regard to its abundance. For example, if you want to read all that was written by me, and there is laughter. Steiner continues, then, faced with such an abundance, it is no wonder that in an initial introductory lecture, some things can only be indicated. Now, let's look more closely at what the esteemed previous speaker just said. He said that pre-existence reminds him of old concepts. But he has been reminded of old concepts only because I used words that have already been in existence in earlier times. Of course, I said that by raising imaginative cognition, which I have characterized, to inspired cognition, which I have also characterized, we arrive at the conviction of pre-existence. When I only describe how in this way we arrive at the intuition of pre-existing life, then the term pre-existence itself does not really matter. What matters is only that I explain how, through exact exercises, we can come to perceive what element of the human being existed before that human essence, if I may express it this way, united with the physical body, with what was being prepared in the mother's body through conception. Thus I use the term pre-existence only to point to something that we can see only if we have developed suprasensory knowledge in the way I described. In Gnosis we find a certain attitude toward this knowledge. Gnosticism as such has nothing to do with what Anthroposophy now intends. But that attitude toward knowledge that was present in the ancient Gnosis and that aims at understanding the suprasensory, that attitude has come alive again in our era. That is, in the era after Galileo, after Copernicus, in a new form. And now I want to tell you in more detail what would still have to be added. I will try to describe it in just a few sentences. You see, when you look back from the perspective of the knowledge we strive for, with the methods I discussed, to an earlier type of knowledge that is very different from the one I described here, then you see an Eastern form of knowledge that could actually also be called theosophical. It was only after that form of knowledge had developed in earlier ages that a philosophy came forth out of theosophy, and then out of that philosophy came Anthroposophy. Of course, if we understand these concepts in such a way that we retain only their abstractness rather than what matters, then we get everything jumbled up, and what is new will appear to us only as a warmed-up version of the old. This theosophy was achieved through very different methods of knowing than the ones I have described here. What was the essence of that method of knowledge? I don't mean all of it, but only a certain phase of them. For example, there was the yoga process of ancient India, and that is definitely not to be warmed up and rehashed in Anthroposophy. We see this from the fact that what I described seems initially to be quite similar to this yoga process, doesn't it? But if you don't read this into what I said, you will not find that what I describe is similar to the yoga process. That process is based on the fact that at a certain stage of humanity's development, when all of human life was less differentiated than is the case in our era, people sensed that there was a connection between the rhythmical process of breathing and the process of thinking. Today we look at the matter from the point of view of physiology, and we know that as we breathe in, we push at the same time the force of the breath through the spinal canal. That is, we push the air we breathe into the brain. The breathing process then continues in the brain in a metamorphosed way, so that you have, seen physiologically, a synthesis of the breathing process and the thinking process. This is the process on which yoga was based. Yoga transformed the usual process of breathing into a differently regulated breathing. As a result of the changed breathing process, that is due to a physical bodily process, thinking was changed. It was transformed in such a way as to make possible a certain conception in the old instinctive sense. In our time we live in a differentiated human organization, and therefore we now have to tackle the thinking process directly. And that is also why we arrive at a very different result. When you look at the concrete details, you will be able to clearly delineate the distinct phases of knowledge as they occurred one after the other in humanity's development. And then you will no longer even come close to the idea that what Anthroposophy, as the way of attaining higher knowledge that is appropriate to our time, offers the present era, can in any way be lumped together with what was available in ancient times. Of course, we cannot debate what I have not even spoken about on the basis of what I told you in an introductory lecture. Naturally, I would have to continue now and explain further what pre-existent life is like. In my introductory lecture, I have not been able to say anything more than that knowledge of pre-existent life is achieved through the processes described, which are indeed different from what has ever been present before in history in terms of human beings' inner development. And now, I would really like to ask what justification there is for criticism when I use the word pre-existence in the sense in which everyone can understand it. It does not mean anything more than what the word says. When I understand existence to mean everything that is experienced through the senses and then speak of pre-existence, then obviously I am referring to an existence in the spiritual soul life prior to sensory existence. This does not point to some old theosophy. I am simply using a word that would have to be explained in more detail if we were to go beyond a merely introductory presentation. Thus, if you really want to know more about theosophy and want to look at what I have described in my book, which I also titled Theosophy, you will find that its beginnings can be traced to ancient forms, much like the beginnings of the chemistry of our time can be traced to alchemy. But the process of knowledge that I have described today is in no way similar to any process of knowledge from ancient times. Therefore, it is completely impossible that what will follow today's lecture, and what thus has not yet been said, can be made the subject of our discussion by claiming that pre-existence comes out of an old toolbox. As you no doubt observed if you followed the lecture, it does not come out of an old collection of tools, but rather continues certain attitudes toward knowledge that also existed back then, when the old tools were still in use and not yet considered old. Nowadays we have only vestiges of these old tools. They project into our time as religious beliefs. whereas in earlier times they were the result of processes of knowledge. Now we must once again, by way of processes of knowledge that are organized along the lines of the knowledge of the natural sciences, arrive at conceptions that can imbue the entire human being, not only the intellectually oriented human being. Ladies and gentlemen, anyone who wants to criticize something in any way must direct the criticism to what was actually said, and not to something that could not be said in the lecture, and of which it is then claimed that it was not supported, or was unfounded, or the like. How can something be unfounded that was merely a simple description? As in all my introductory lectures, I have done nothing more than describe something. Only those who know what happens when one really takes these things up would be able to say that something was unsubstantiated. Really, taking these things up means no longer just speaking about them from the outside. Then you will see that these things have a much deeper foundation than any mathematical science, because they come much closer to the sphere of the soul than the mathematical processes do. And therefore, such a critique is an extraordinarily superficial one. Indeed, always being understood only in this superficial, external way is precisely what makes it so extraordinarily difficult for anthroposophy to establish itself. In no other science do people expect that just one lecture will give them everything. Only anthroposophy is expected to be given in its entirety in one lecture. I have said from the outset that I cannot do that. Applause. Steiner continues. The point here is not that I describe the old tools that are still available. For example, how the Gnostics in inner soul processes arrived at that sort of knowledge, or how the Eastern yoga schools arrived at knowledge. People who know those tools, instead of just talking about them, applause, will then no longer claim that anthroposophy is reminiscent of the old. People can make that claim only as long as they allow reminiscences to come to them in the form of abstract concepts that owe their existence simply to the fact that they have not yet been compared to the concrete, to reality. Of course, I could go on much longer, but this may suffice as an answer for now. Lively applause. Then Mr. H. Schmidt. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to criticize something, or rather place a question mark next to it, namely the following. Dr. Steiner said this evening that every scientific worldview is dualistic, in the sense that to what is immediate and certain, it must add what is uncertain. It is obvious that where anthroposophy is concerned, this other element is the suprasensory world. But the scientific value of a philosophy lies in the degree to which it succeeds in presenting the inner relationship between the suprasensory world and the sensory realm. Please note that I intentionally use the expression scientific value, and am not speaking about the cultural or psychological value. For example, Platonism, which did not succeed all that often in constructing the relationship between idea and reality, had an immense cultural significance. Now, in Anthroposophy, Dr. Steiner is trying to show the relationship between the suprasensory and the sensory realms. That is, he is trying to show the necessary transition from the immediate sensory world to the suprasensory world, or seen subjectively, from empirical and rational knowledge, from scientific knowledge, to, if you will, super-scientific knowledge. For this purpose he uses Anthroposophy. I am basing what I say only on Dr. Steiner's lecture and primarily on its first part. Quite frankly, my ability was not sufficient for the second part. Applause. H. Schmidt continues. Anthroposophy relies on the analogy to mathematics. Dr. Steiner explained how we project mathematics into nature. As we know, this was already established in the sciences of ancient Greece and is also well known. It is at any rate the ideal of the mathematical natural sciences to mathematize nature, as the ancients already put it. But in what sense can this be spoken of at all? That is the problem. Dr. Steiner explained with what emotion, with what passion, and with what personal involvement individual mathematicians assert their ideas of conceptual things in empirical reality. But what are the forms and constructions mathematicians are dealing with? These are not their ideas. For example, a circle a mathematician draws on the blackboard in order to demonstrate geometrical theorems. That circle is not the mathematician's idea. As a human being, he has nothing whatever to do with that circle. And perhaps he has nothing to do with it as a mathematician either, but as a human being only insofar as he uses his two eyes to perceive the circle. There is commotion. Schmidt continues. The concept of the circle that the mathematician is obviously dealing with cannot be presented in reality at all. It is never an object of sensory perception. Rather, the concept of the circle is a general one. Now, anthroposophy in particular needs something personal and real that it wants to project into nature. The general concepts that I have in my mathematical mind, so to speak, do not exist anywhere in reality. Thus, if the suprasensory world is to be based upon the sensory world in such a way that we can extrapolate from the subject to the object, then this can never be achieved by projecting subjective ideas into nature as mathematics does with its ideas. Therefore, the mathematical analogy in particular is not at all suited for this purpose, because mathematics is dealing with concepts that as such do not ever exist in reality. In my view, this is an objection to anthroposophy as a whole. On the other hand, today's lecture in particular emphasized the reality of suprasensory things. Thus, my point is that I cannot see how mathematics is to serve here to explain the bridge from the sensory realm to the suprasensory one. The main value of today's lecture was apparently the point that personal experience, personal excitement, indeed the totality of personal experience, is to be actively involved in thinking. But that must raise a concern in everyone, for the personal, the individual element, in particular, lacks necessity. What I personally envision, well, anybody can then say to me, it's only your fantasy, your imagination, and I have nothing to do with that. That, in my view, is an objection to anthroposophy as a whole. Applause. And then what was particularly important to Dr. Steiner, in the inner sympathy and engagement that his lecture evoked precisely at that point, it was indeed moving even for his opponents, namely the statement that Dr. Steiner sees moral intuition as the starting point for higher knowledge. Anthroposophy needs something suprasensory from which to derive moral principles, and it achieves this derivation, in particular, by perceiving the suprasensory. And that, quite frankly, I don't understand. Let us assume for the moment that there is a suprasensory cognitive faculty, or rather such cognitive faculties that we ordinary mortals do not yet have, and that it would indeed be possible to perceive the suprasensory with this higher cognitive faculty, to see the suprasensory realm as something really existing. How can I see from that what I ought to do? What I ought to do can never be derived from what is. There is no bridge from the sphere of what is to the sphere of what ought to be. Walter Berkicht. Since for the time being there are no other requests to speak, I ask Dr. Steiner to please respond to this. Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin with, I want to say the following. On the whole, the nature of what I said this evening prevented me from speaking of analogy at the point where I talked about mathematics. And I ask you to remember carefully that I did not use the term analogy. That is no accident, but entirely deliberate. I could not use the word analogy because I was not talking about an analogy to mathematics. Rather, I used mathematical thinking to characterize the inner experience of certainty. And by trying to clarify how one arrives at an inner experience of certainty in mathematics, I wanted to show how in a very different sphere, where one tries to arrive at certainty in the same way, it is indeed possible to come to that same degree of certainty. Thus, it is not a question of an analogy to mathematics. Rather, it is a matter of presenting two real types of soul experience that are to be compared in nothing other than by reference to the attainment of inner certainty. Ladies and gentlemen, what the previous speaker said, therefore, does not follow on from my lecture. For if it did, he could not have used the word analogy. I have avoided that word because it does not belong there. Moreover, the previous speaker said that I spoke of the passion and enthusiasm of the individual mathematician. But that too cannot be the case, because I simply referred to the nature of the mathematical experience familiar to those who are initiated, schooled in mathematics. It is unfathomable to me how one can even come up with the idea of any personal meddling in mathematics. By contrast, I want to make the following comments. It sounds very nice to say that the inner concept of the circle has nothing whatever to do with the circle I draw on the blackboard, and of course I will not maintain that it has anything to do with the circle I draw, because it does not even cross my mind to say that the inner concept of the circle consists of chalk. This expresses no particularly profound truth, I would say. But when we move from the abstract kind of thinking to a kind of thinking that is in accordance with reality, then we have to realize the following. Let's imagine something we inwardly construct mathematically. For example, the following theorem. When we draw the diameter of a circle, and then connect one endpoint of the diameter with a line to any random point on the circumference of the circle, and from this point then draw another line to the other endpoint of the diameter, then the angle we get there is always a right angle. I don't even need to draw this on the blackboard for you to prove it. What I realized there, namely that in a circle every angle above the circumference with its apex on the periphery is a right angle, is an inner experience. I don't need to use the circle on the blackboard here. And there's a shout from the audience. That's not true. Only when you have looked at it can you do the construction afterward. Steiner continuing. But without a doubt, what I draw outwardly on the blackboard is only an external aid. It is completely out of the question that people who can think mathematically would not be able to construct such mathematical truths, even the most complicated of such truths, purely in their inner experience. There is no question of that. Even if I had to rely on drawing those truths with chalk, that would still be irrelevant for the simple reason that the substantial validity of the theorem may be illustrated in the drawing, but does not have to be determined by it. If I illustrate for myself with the drawing on the blackboard that the angle is a right angle, this illustration does not say anything specific about the theorem's inner validity, and that is the important thing. There can be no question of first needing the drawing on the blackboard. But even if I did need the drawing, this would be completely irrelevant regarding what I have said about the nature of mathematizing, not about solving individual problems, but about mathematizing as such. What is crucial here lies in an entirely different sphere from what we have just discussed. For when we look at mathematizing, we are led to the insight that we experience inner truths. I also did not say that in mathematics we already experience realities. Therefore, it is entirely irrelevant when someone objects that mathematics as such does not contain any reality. In its formal aspects, it does indeed contain truths, and these can also be experienced. The path is important. It matters how we arrive at the truth, and how we arrive at knowledge, even though both initially have no reality within mathematics itself. But when we now transfer this mathematical experience to an entirely different sphere, namely to the one where we now apply the precision of mathematics to the real life of the soul, then the character of the precision we have first experienced in the mathematical formal sphere will be carried into the real. And only then do we have the right to carry into reality what is valid in mathematics only as a formal element. I have shown first how we arrive from the inside at truths that we seemingly transfer, albeit only in an external way, as unreality to observation, to experiments, or that we weave into experiments. And I showed how this formal character metamorphoses into a real one. But even then, what seems so plausible still does not apply, namely, that what is mathematical lives only in me, that the concept lives only in me, and does not live out there in reality, that what has been investigated and developed mathematically as such has nothing to do with reality. For does the concept of the circle really live only within me? Let's assume I don't draw a circle on the blackboard, but I have here my 2 fingers, and hold a string there, and set an object in circular motion, so that a small lead ball moves in a circle. The laws of motion that I now recognize by seeing them mathematically, do they have nothing to do with reality? I always proceed precisely in such a way that I determine the method in reality through mathematics. The way I proceed then, as I move from induction to deduction, is that I bring in what I initially found through induction, and then process it further with mathematics. When I put the end product of an empirical induction into a mathematical formula, and then simply continue with the calculations, then I count on what I develop mathematically through deduction as corresponding to reality. Because of that, only the mathematical is fruitful for reality, and not because of such philosophical arguments as have been presented here. Let us look at the fruitfulness of mathematics for reality. We can see this fruitfulness simply when, after realizing that there are irregularities deviating from the calculations, people say they will add another mathematical quantity into the calculation. And this is how we arrive at assuming a reality in a purely mathematical way. The reality turns up later. It is simply there. Thus, by continuing my empirical path purely through mathematics, I have shown that what is experienced inwardly can be applied to the outside world. At least I count on that. If we could not count on the fact that the real course of events we observe in the sensory visible world up to a certain point continues in our calculations, then what I have been talking about would not be possible at all, namely, that we feel satisfied in mathematics. What matters is that we take the concepts seriously as they have been explained here. Now, to the comment regarding what I said about moral intuition. As you may remember, in my lecture I said that intuition, which I called the 3rd stage of suprasensory knowledge and perception, appears last. But moral intuition appears already in ordinary consciousness. It is the only suprasensory capacity that already penetrates from the suprasensory world into consciousness at our level. Moral intuition is simply an intuition on a higher level that is projected down to our level of knowledge. I have clearly shown this in my lecture. That is why I spoke first about this moral intuition instead of waiting with it until later. I named it the starting point. We learn to recognize it, and when we have understood it correctly, we have a certain subjective precondition for understanding what comes after that. For when we compare with our usual reality what we experience in moral intuition, we find that the latter has a different kind of reality, namely, quote, ought reality, close quote, the reality of ought. If you pay attention to the details of what I said, you will see that the difference between what is and what ought to be simply arises from the fact that the moral intuition projects into the sphere of our ordinary consciousness, while the higher intuition is not a projecting down, but must be actively achieved by us. I didn't say anything about moral intuition being some kind of special case in the process of knowing general intuition. Rather, it is simply the first case where something intuitive appears in our ordinary consciousness, in our current state of consciousness. Thus, what matters here is a precise understanding of the concepts that are developed for Anthroposophy. I wanted to give you suggestions. I fully understand that objections are possible, because naturally not everything can be explained in this detailed way, and so I assume that there are still many doubts in the souls of those present here. But just think how long my lecture would have needed to be if I had tried in this way to clear away those doubts in my lecture, the doubts I am now trying to clear up in my answer. All this is to be expected in a first introductory lecture, and not only in anthroposophy, but in all areas. That's what the lecture today was about. I did not at all intend to offer something all-inclusive and final, and I must say that some people absolutely do not want to accept anthroposophy at all. But I have found that often those who come to know anthroposophy best are not the ones who take a liking to it right away. Rather, the best workers in anthroposophy are often the ones who have overcome bitter doubts. Therefore, please do not take what I said with some severity in my reply, as though it were meant in a hostile way. On the whole, I am pleased with everything that is objected to here, because only if we can clear away these hurdles of objections can we actually enter into anthroposophy. And I have always felt more satisfied with those who have come to anthroposophy over the hurdles of rejection and doubt than with those who came to anthroposophy right away and in full sail. There is lively applause. Then, Mr. Wilhelm. I don't want to criticize anything, but only want to ask a question and would be very interested in Dr. Steiner's answer. Dr. Steiner replied to the criticism of the first speaker, who compared theosophy and anthroposophy, saying that anthroposophy's method of knowledge is very different from that of theosophy, particularly the old theosophy, and that in all of history, not anywhere can any reference or hint be found regarding the method of knowledge presented by Dr. Steiner this evening. I just want to ask in this connection whether Dr. Steiner is familiar with certain passages entitled The Green Face, a book that has a strong theosophical tinge, where that method of knowledge actually forms the foundation of the entire work. I would be very interested in knowing Dr. Steiner's position on this. Rudolf Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out first of all that if there really are echoes reminiscent of what I have said this evening in that book titled The Green Face, which was published a few years ago, then it would be possible to trace this to anthroposophy. And there is a shout, "Never!" Steiner continues. I've only said in general that this would not be contradictory, but now that someone here shouted "Never," I am in full agreement, for I find nothing anthroposophical in The Green Face, but rather find that what is said in that book about anthroposophy is based on methods of knowledge with which I want nothing to do. That is what I have to say to that.